Britain takes its case against Moscow to the UN over the poisoning of a former Russian spy at a time of friction over Brexit and an unpredictable White House. How will a divided West tackle a resurgent Russia, which is again defining itself, at least according to President Putin, as a great power? Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. The rhetoric of the Cold War appears to be back, with strong words at the UN Security Council and the expulsion of 23 Russian diplomats from Britain. The US, France and Germany, along with the UK, have issued a joint statement blaming Moscow for the poisoning of the former spy Sergei Skripal and his daughter in the UK. Vladimir Putin's expected to win a fourth term in Sunday's presidential election, and he's been talking about Russia's weapons capability this month. In his State of the Union speech 2 weeks ago, he said that new nuclear missiles that could penetrate any US defense system are being developed. The United States has been sending mixed messages on how to deal with Russia. President Donald Trump has repeatedly been ambiguous, but others in his administration say that Russia should be held accountable.
The United States stands in absolute solidarity with Great Britain. The United States believes that Russia is responsible for the attack on 2 people in the United Kingdom using a military-grade nerve agent. Dozens of civilians and first responders were also exposed.
Russia says the accusations are insane and that Britain's refusing to cooperate with Moscow in the investigation into the incident.
We are extremely concerned about what has taken place several days ago on the territory of the United Kingdom. We are taking information about the situation of using chemical weapons on the territory of the United Kingdom with utmost concern. To this day, I can confirm this again. London refuses to provide any factual information regarding this case.
So is there a rush to judgment by Western powers on Russia? Let's bring in our guests for today. From Moscow, we're joined by Vyacheslav Matuzov, a former Russian diplomat in London, Matthew Goodwin, senior visiting fellow in the Europe programme at Chatham House. And from Santander in Spain, via Skype, is Fabrice Pothier, Chief Strategy Officer at Rasmussen Global and former Director of Policy Planning for NATO. Gentlemen, good to have you with us. Vyacheslav, let's start with you. Britain's Prime Minister Theresa May says there's no alternative conclusion other than that the Russian state was responsible for the attempted murder of Mr. Skripal and his daughter. What do you make of that?
Well, I cannot imagine that Russian government it was in some of such kind of affairs related, because it is absolutely clear today it is step to spoiling Russian-Western relations. And this concrete situation that Putin is before a presidential election, because Russia is interested to calm down any international influence on inside situation. So I don't think that Russia have any connection with this case, and all what is we are watching today is based on allegations. I think that thorough studying of the case could give a good answer for what's happening indeed. But on my opinion, it is the part of more broader development or more broader position of the Western countries vis-à-vis Russia, because we can combine this with Russian behavior in Syria, and all that was made in Ghouta, Eastern Ghouta, and in Ukraine and many other places. I think that the policy that Russia demonstrates right now before the Western world is absolutely independent from its position. America was upset with Russian behavior. Russia confronting American policy in many places in the world, Ukraine, Middle East, and even Far East. So I think that it is the part of global confrontation with Russian Federation, that was used by this case in London.
Okay.
I don't believe that Russia have any connection with this case because it is not in the interest right now to Russia.
Matthew Goodwin in London, you heard what Vyacheslav was saying there. What do you make of that?
Well, I think there's clearly a very consistent line coming from Berlin, Paris, London and Washington that the nature of the material, the fact that it is high-grade, a high-grade military nerve agent, really puts all arrows pointing in one direction. And the argument certainly made by Theresa May and also the US and people from the security services is that if this isn't anything to do with Russia, then put forward a plausible explanation. There are only two scenarios. One is that it did come from Russia, sanctioned by the Russian state. The other is that the Russian state has lost control over high-grade military nerve agents. Those are effectively the two scenarios that are at play. Meanwhile, the British government has pushed ahead with the sanctions, which, no government is going to impose the most significant sanctions that they've seen since the mid-1980s unless they have compelling, credible intelligence from the security services that point to where this substance has come from. So all arrows are pointing in the same direction.
Fabrice Pothier in Santander. Vyacheslav was echoing Russia's envoy to the UN, who called the Salisbury poisoning a false flag attack, possibly by the UK itself, in order to discredit Russia. I mean, how plausible is that? Does anyone believe that there could be another explanation, that Russia was really not involved in this?
Well, first, with all respect for your Russian guest, his intervention reminded me of Foreign Minister Lavrov's interventions at the North Atlantic Council, meaning they basically overwhelm you with facts, some true, some distorted. They make connections which are not really the real matter of the question here. And in the end, they are creating this doubt, or trying to create this doubt that, in fact, this is a plot of the West against Russia. So I don't think it really stands the test of evidence. As Matthew said it just earlier, there is an overwhelming body of evidence that points to a nerve agent produced in Russia having been used by the Russian authorities to attempt a murder on the former Russian spy. And this is, in a way, also a declared policy by the Russian state that they have the right to aim at former Russian spies or considered traitors outside the Russian territory. So sadly, this is part of a pattern that has been existing now for more than 4 years. And I think this is the big question now is, how do we respond to it? Because clearly this is a watershed event. And it cannot be seen as just a small attempt. It's a very significant one, using a highly lethal nerve agent in the middle of a British city on daylight. So I think now the real question is how robust, but also how collective the response should be from Britain, but also the British, NATO and EU allies.
Okay, we'll come on to the response in a little more depth in just a few moments. But just before we move on, Vyacheslav, you heard what both Matthew and Fabrice were saying there about this overwhelming body of evidence against Russia. Britain's Foreign Secretary said that Russia's smug, sarcastic response to this incident indicates its fundamental guilt, that they want to simultaneously deny it, yet at the same time glory in it. He's got a point, hasn't he?
Well, Russia demonstrated absolutely independent course in international affairs. She doesn't join American activity in the Middle East and many other areas in the world. So I think that it is the main reason why now confrontation is rising from day to day between the West, headed by the United States, and Russia. We watch it in very different regions of the world, and I think that it before Russian presidential elections. This tension, increased tension with Vladimir Putin, will help him in his electoral campaign inside the Russian Federation, because more pressing will be on Putin.
So I just want to pick you up on something you said, Vyacheslav, right at the beginning of the program, when you felt that Russia's role in Syria, in Crimea and Ukraine may have something to do with all of this.
Crimea is absolutely, definitely, Russia will never change its attitude and never withdraw from Crimea. It is a sacred place for Russians, and Putin will enjoy support from all Russian population. It is not only his decision. I think that consolidating public opinion for in favor of Putin will be absolutely right now. That's why before the electional period he make a visit to Crimea, and he demonstrated the big success of Russia when it accepted Crimea Russians to Russian Federation. I think he is not contradicted with his own interests before electorate, and that's why I consider that Crimea, it is a big card in the hand of Putin vis-à-vis all this electoral struggle that we're watching today in Russia, because he's really faced now a strong oppositional leader, Goodwin, from left side, who is demanding from him change his internal economical, social, and political course inside Russia. And he is losing to Goodwin in many fields. Now he compensates his losses inside policy while he is demonstrating his loyalty Russia in Crimea, in Ukraine, in strong position in the international level vis-à-vis Great Britain, vis-à-vis the United States, in demonstrating their opportunities, military opportunities in Syria. So I think that it is the framework of the struggle. Putin is gaining points from the point of view of electoral interest.
All right. Matthew Goodwin, the US ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, said that if we don't take immediate concrete measures to address this, Salisbury won't be the last place that we see chemical weapons used. She called it a defining moment. Is it?
I think in some respects it is. Boris Johnson, the British Foreign Secretary, was quite careful this morning to say that this does not mark a return to the Cold War, but I think in some respects it will become something of a watershed in the new post-Cold War relationship between Russia and the West. There is a sense that in Westminster at least, and I think also in Washington, that past events like the murder of Litvinenko really was not taken seriously by the Russian state, that those reactions from Britain were not hard enough. I think now you're seeing the rolling out of a more thorough response. Over 20 diplomats expelled. The royal family told that they will be boycotting the World Cup. I suspect there'll be further pressure on travel bans and the movement of assets by wealthy Russians in London. Putin's going to, at some point today, announce his response to that, and there will be retaliations. But what we may see over the next day or two is actually the West's response begin to spiral into France and Germany and the United States, who may join that action coming from Britain. So we are nowhere near the end of this issue. It will likely spiral, and you know, it will ultimately undermine the bilateral relationship between Britain and Russia, but also Russia's standing vis-a-vis the West.
Fabrice, if Russia is behind the Salisbury poisoning, what's going on here? Is Putin testing alliances, looking to test the West's resolve? If the UK pushes back hard against Russia, to what extent is it merely giving President Putin exactly what he wants?
Well, that's the one point where I agree with the Russian guest, is that there is a game here played by Putin to gain some points abroad, to hide his losses at home, and especially his economic situation. But it's also a game that he provokes himself. He chooses to be on the offensive. And I can tell you, having been inside the machine room at NATO during the Ukraine conflict, there's a great reluctance from the Western allies to enter into a confrontation and to escalate. But as Matthew just said, and as I said earlier, this is a watershed event. And the question now is how concrete and collective the responses are going to be. The measures announced yesterday by the British Prime Minister are firm, but mostly symbolic. Even the sanctions she floated will not be automatic sanctions. They might become sanctions if there are proven cases of Russian individuals being involved in some cases. So I think it's not as strong as it sounds, but the real strength could come again from how the NATO and the European allies can respond. And I think here it's about also the Western leaders taking their responsibility. We have heard since 2014, basically since the Ukraine conflict, countless statements about hybrid war, that the West will respond, that the West was getting ready. Here we have a hybrid war. The question is whether a hybrid attack on one ally is an attack on all the allies. And I think this is really where we have to see leadership both from London, but also from Washington and the European capitals. What does it mean concretely? It could mean, first, replicating the British sanction into EU-wide sanctions. Next week, you have a European Council with all the EU leaders, including Theresa May. And I think here she could make a call to make basically a new EU package of sanctions against Russia. On the NATO side, I think it means this is a situation of collective defense. She has said herself, this is an unlawful use of force by Russia against Britain. This is a case of self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter, which could be the prelude to also invoke NATO's collective defense clause, Article 5. It doesn't mean there's going to be an automatic military response, but it means there's a clear statement not only of solidarity, but of readiness to act. The question and the bottom line is, if we don't act, what is going to prevent Russia from doing that again in the future?
Yeah. But Fabrice, if you can give me a short answer, if you would, just on the EU for a moment, how united will the response be, given that some of the states in the east of the EU are former Soviet bloc countries who naturally are wary of their big neighbour to the east?
Well, yes, I think the real issue will be coming more from the Western member states, mostly Italy, Germany, and France, whether they will be willing to basically negotiate a new package of sanctions. Paradoxically, I think there could be actually more potential inside the EU, especially to do financial sanctions, that there might be inside NATO to do concrete measures, because NATO will be seen by some European allies as too escalatory. So I think there's a real card to play here by Britain, and it's a twist of history that almost a year before leaving the European Union, Britain might be actually calling for one of the greatest EU show of solidarity.
Vyacheslav, you heard what Fabrice was saying there. If there is a united EU package of sanctions against Russia, if NATO takes self-defense measures, are we entering a new Cold War with Russia here?
Well, I think that the Cold War is going on, and in some places it is, even in a hot war, not only Cold War, because when you watch our relations with the United States in the Syrian area, in the Syrian region, for example, we have a direct confrontation between American and Russian military services. One of them supported Kurdish forces, another Syrian governmental forces. So I think that situation is right dangerous. It needs contact and diplomatic and political measures to settle down all contradictions. What we watch today, we watch when any chance to meet Mr. Putin with Mr. Trump, and we watch that Mr. Trump is avoiding even welcome his Russian colleague. That's why no dialogue, no political contacts, no coordination in any other place, because in our opinion, our current relations with the United States is characterized by the attempts for the United States to make from Russia one of their satellites. It is impossible in a real situation, and I think that's the main reason of the increasing tension. And all these cases of poisoning people in the Great Britain, killing in Great Britain. And there is a big question for us, for Russians. Why what is happening of such kind of killings, poisoning, only in Great Britain? What is the soil, what is the air in Great Britain that kill people there, Russian people? Because the last person, he was traveling to London after freeing from the arrest.
Okay.
He was absolutely clean when he left the country.
Yeah.
And now he has no accusations for the have any secret.
All right, Matthew Goodwin. Look, I want to ask you a question about Britain's response and whether Russia has miscalculated here. But it just occurs to me: are we now likely to see, do you think, a campaign of Russian-authored misinformation and obfuscation aimed at British and US audiences now?
I think that's likely. That's certainly consistent with Russia's past action. What we've heard, even during this conversation, is a lot of talk about international relations, a lot of talk about the Russian election. We've not actually heard any credible response to the specific threat that is, the specific issue that is at hand, which is how did this happen if it did not indeed originate in Russia? And that's the question that the Russians have to answer. And they can talk about Syria and they can talk about Putin's election, but how did a high-grade military nerve agent get to the point where it is being deployed on the British ordinary streets? I mean, that's the question they need to answer, not international relations. So I think there will be a very strong and concerted and consistent response from the UK and the UK's allies, and that will continue for some time to come.
And Fabrice, a very quick answer from you, please, because we're almost out of time. If Russia is behind this attack, has it miscalculated?
No, because I think on the short term it's going to play in the Putin's playbook, especially ahead of the elections. And on the long term, yes, because Russia is going to keep on being put into a corner economically, especially by the West. When there was talk since the Trump administration arrived of maybe lifting some of the sanctions, I think now, again, we've passed a new line, and Russia is going to be kept and contained economically as long as it doesn't show a change of behavior. You can have as many diplomats and as much dialogue as you want, and I think everybody welcomed that. But as long as you don't have a Russian change of behavior, and that change of behavior will come from exerting containment and force until Russia sees that it's not in its interest to keep on being disruptive and aggressive.
Okay. Gentlemen, there we must end it. Many thanks indeed for being with us. Vyacheslav Matuzov in Moscow, Matthew Goodwin in London, and Fabrice Pothier in Santander. Thanks for watching. Don't forget you can see the programme anytime just by going to the website aljazeera.com. For further discussion, join us at our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, and you can also join the conversation on Twitter, our handle @AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finighan, and the whole team here in Doha. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again. Bye for now.